happy to send you all a copy of my life story, but I know people much prefer to hear the talk than to hear the introduction. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I see at least one person I know in the audience, and that's Simon Perlsweig, the only undergraduate I ever taught who wrote a paper good enough to be a book, and he went out and got it published. So, I'm always happy to see Simon. He's one of the feathers in my cap. I am so pleased to be able to talk to you tonight about this book, Creating Connecticut, because of all the books I've written four or five. This is the one that I wrote, I think, with the most intentionality. And it's written to be a certain kind of book to get away from the ponderous academic prose text and footnote laden texts that are so much a part of one side of my calling, and to create a book that really is a wonderful and accessible book about Connecticut history. Now, when I got done with this book, I I thought a lot about how I'm going to introduce it to people, and I worried about this a lot. You really never know. They say no author truly knows what their book is about until it's finished. And when I got down, I thought, okay, I've got this book. I'm proud of it. I really want people to approach it in the way in which I kind of intended for the book to be received. How am I going to tell them about this? And I thought back to a long way back, to my very first day as a graduate PhD student in history at the University of Connecticut. And I remember going into the classroom with Richard D. Brown, a distinguished University of Connecticut professor. And distinguished is a title in this case. It's an honorific, not just an adjective. And he is a kind of daunting, dour, demanding professor. And I was so excited that I was finally going to become a professional historian. And I remember going in there, I'd read the book. I am now, suddenly, I am imbibing history. It's like drinking out of a fire hose, and I'm just primed to answer every question he might ask and to show what a good student I was going to be. So we sit down, and he delivers his first question to me and my fellow graduate students. And he said, "Why did the author write this book?" And I was completely nonplussed. Of all the questions I could have answered, that was the one that it had never crossed my mind. And we spent the next 3 hours of that night unpacking that question, going through why we thought the author had written the book, and we spent each of the next 15 weeks doing that. By the end of the semester, I realized that question, why did the author write this book, is one of the most important questions that it's one of the most important questions that you can ask about a book. So with your permission, what I'm going to do now is share my screen, show you the title of Creating Connecticut, and then tell you why I wrote this book. As Connecticut State Historian, I've had the good fortune to spend my career focusing my historical research on this state, its people, and their stories. Creating Connecticut is a product of that effort. It's a collection of 24 stories, 12 shorter, 12 longer, each of which tells us something important about Connecticut's past, something that still, in one way or another, affects our lives as Connecticutans today. All of them are designed to be readable, engaging, and informative introductions to aspects of our state's history that will be new, or nearly so, to most readers. Some of the stories in Creating Connecticut show people we thought we knew, Mark Twain, Nathan Hale, in new and surprising ways. Some tell us about people many of us don't know about, Eleazar Wheelock, Samson Occam, Adrian Block, but perhaps we ought to. And many of the stories are about events, movements, and periods of change. The Pequot War, the Hartford Witch Hunt, outmigration to Connecticut's Western Reserve, Irish immigration into the state. Crucial moments when Connecticutans were tested and called on by circumstances to change their minds, values, approaches, and even lives. Times much like the one we're living through right now. And some of the stories are about the uniqueness of our state and the ways in which Connecticutans have celebrated the past in the past. The focus here is on stories that both interest and matter. You can read them from front to back. They're arranged more or less in chronological order, or you can scan the table of contents and jump in with the story that seems most interesting to you. My hope, and the ultimate reason I wrote this book, is that you'll read them all and come away with a desire to know more about Connecticut history. If I can do that with this book, then I have done my job as a state historian, and I will be happy. So, what I'd like to do with the rest of the talk is read passages from a few of the stories in Creating Connecticut, then I'll answer any questions you may have, and then I'll tell you how you can get your own. Well, there's somebody who is waiting to get in, so let me see if I can let them in while we're...
I took care of that, Walt.
Oh, you did? Okay,
yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, what I'd like to do with the rest of the talk is read passages from a few of the stories in Creating Connecticut, answer any questions you may have, and then I'll tell you how you can get your own signed copy of this rare literary gem, which is what my wife says it is, which is probably why she's my wife. And I'll begin with a reading from Creating Connecticut's first story about Connecticut's restless beginnings and the 50 years of conflict between the Dutch and English and the indigenous peoples of this state, a restless era that is today an all but forgotten part of our history. It begins on a day in the year April of 1614. In the spring of 1614, Adrian Block sailed the little ship he had built and named Onrust, Restlessness, into the river the Algonquians called Connecticut, or the place of the long water. The 47-year-old Dutchman was as restless as his little vessel, and anxious to make up the losses he had experienced the previous winter when his ship Tiger had accidentally burned to the waterline at Manhattan. The trader and explorer was anxious, too, to secure the Dutch government's recent promise of a trading monopoly over any new countries or harbors discovered by Dutch explorers. Restless to turn his fortunes around, Block came up a river that was itself restless, running fresh and full of upriver snowmelt and spring rain. He named the river the Versha, meaning fresh as in fast running, and as the first known European to probe its courses and seek its opportunities, he launched an era of restlessness that would change this river and its people forever. Then, as now, restless had many meanings, and all would apply to the world the arrival of this little boat would create. A generation of restless Europeans, both Dutch and English, constantly in motion, never ceasing or pausing, would come to the Connecticut, the place of the long water, first in search of trade with the indigenous people, and soon after in quest of those people's land and resources. Some of them were spiritually restless, troubled in mind and soul, and seeking a place to serve their God as their consciences demanded. For the Native Americans already here, the arrival of the Onrust heralded a new restlessness, first as they jostled to control distribution of European trade goods, and later as they fought the incoming insurgents' efforts to take their lands and control their lives. For Connecticut's first peoples, the arrival of the Onrust brought centuries of restlessness, literal unrest, sleepless worry, sickness, turmoil, and death. Time is the acid rain of historical memory. Slowly, often over generations stretching into centuries, important details of the past can fade one by one until what was once crucial to the life of a time and people is all but forgotten. So it has been with the Dutch history of Connecticut. Most school children are still taught that the first European to come to Connecticut was Adrian Block, and many students of Hartford history know the Dutch had a trading house there, somewhere close to the later site of Samuel Colt's arms complex in Hartford. But for the average Connecticut, that's the sum of it. The English arrived and the Dutch faded to black. The rest of the colonial story as they remember it is a simplistic tale of English versus Indians that quickly morphs into one about patriots versus Tories. But that's not how it was. For its first 50 years, Connecticut was a restless, seething site of constant competition, pitting nation against nation, tribe against tribe, and colonies against colonies, in a Rubik's Cube of combinations that always involved the Dutch. Nothing was done by the English at Connecticut without first calculating the Dutch response in New Netherland or at the States General, the seat of government in The Hague. No English settlement was expanded, no tribal alliance contracted, no trading venture launched without calculating the Dutch reaction. The Dutch Connecticut story was a deeply conflicted, sometimes harrowing experience. Those who lived in that time knew their lives depended on knowing that story in great detail. Now, I go on in this chapter to highlight the nearly continuous state of conflict between the various English plantations, Dutch authorities, and Indian communities, and the shifting alliances that made life a restless and fearful struggle for everyone in Connecticut's first half century. It was a restless era that set the stage for much that came after, including Connecticut's unique history of witch hunting. In another chapter, I look at some of the issues that the history of that terrible moment raises. Connecticut's record in handling witchcraft cases raises many questions. Some are unique to Connecticut, some apply to all witch hunts. Why, for example, in the early years of witch hunting, 1647 to 1663, was Connecticut New England's fiercest prosecutor of witches? Why did it switch from being the region's greatest witch killer to the colony that ended executions permanently a generation before Salem? Why did people even believe in witchcraft? What exactly did people think witches could do? And why did it scare them so much? Why were most witches women? And what was it that made someone who had been a neighbor for many years suddenly so dangerous that community safety made executing them mandatory? Now, the answer to those questions began not in Connecticut, of course, but in Europe. And in the chapter I trace the Renaissance history of witch hunting, I explain the magical view of the world that made such hunts possible, and I discuss the English witch hunts that were peaking when the Puritans emigrated to Connecticut. The Puritans who came to New England in the early decades of the 1600s carried their fear of the devil and his minions to New England along with their Bibles, clothing, and seed stock. England's greatest witch hunt took place between 1644 and 1647 in the Puritan counties of East Anglia. There, a man named Matthew Hopkins, who styled himself England's witch-finder general, led a witch hunt that resulted in many executions. Some sources claim 300. The East Anglian location of Hopkins' witch hunt is significant. It's the place from which many of Connecticut's early settlers emigrated. They knew much about, and some had direct connections to, the Hopkins trials. Many must have feared that if the devil was assaulting the English Puritans that furiously in East Anglia, it was only a matter of time until he would find his way to New England. So it's not surprising, I think, that New England's first execution for witchcraft took place in 1647, just as the witch hunt in England was winding down. Now, perhaps the most interesting thing about this first New England witch death is that we wouldn't know anything about it except for two sentences that appeared in two different documents produced 100 miles away from each other and found some 250 years apart. Sometime between March and May of 1647, Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop, whose History Journal of New England is one of our most important historical sources from this period, wrote in that journal the following sentence: one, and he left a blank, of Windsor, arraigned and executed at Hartford for a witch. Winthrop left the blank space intending, no doubt, to add the witch's name once he'd received further information. But for the next 257 years, that's all that was known. Some person who lived in Windsor was tried for witchcraft in Hartford and then executed. What was she charged with? Who conducted the trial? Who testified against her? What was her defense? Where was she hanged? None of this was known. In truth, historians didn't even know whether New England's first convicted witch was a man or a woman. But then, in 1904, Annie Elliott Trumbull, daughter of Connecticut's first state librarian, announced that she had come into possession of a little old volume with a worn sheepskin binding that contained the manuscript diary of Matthew Grant, a resident of Windsor from 1635 to 1681. In it, she reported, she had found a Grant-penned entry stating that on May 26, 1647, Alice Young was hanged. Finally, after 2.5 centuries, it was confirmed that New England's first executed witch was, as supposed, a woman, and that her name was Alice Young. Now that remains most of what is known for certain about her, though historian Richard Ross has recently argued that Alice emigrated to Windsor from London in 1640, which may have put her culturally at odds with her Windsor neighbors, most of whom had emigrated from the English West Country. These cultural differences, Ross argues, made her an outsider, which, combined with an epidemic of deadly influenza that hit Windsor the year of Young's execution, may have factored in her being singled out for prosecution. Now, the chapter in the book goes on to detail Connecticut's record as early New England's fiercest prosecutor of witchcraft, and then how one man, Governor John Winthrop Jr., himself an alchemist and magic practitioner, intervened to bring witch executions in Connecticut to an end. It's a powerful story, I think, with a message that's just as important and just as riveting as any from the better-known Salem trials, and I think you'd enjoy it. For the past decade, many Connecticutans, and especially our younger generation, have left our state to seek their fortunes elsewhere. This is troublesome, but it's not the first time it's happened. In another chapter, I tell the story of the great outflux of young Connecticutans in the early 1800s, as the dream or necessity of finding a better life took them to a part of Ohio known as the Connecticut Western Reserve. Here are a few passages that talk about their journeys west and their feelings about leaving. Connecticut in the early 19th century, as in the 20th century, was hemorrhaging its young people, the lifeblood of its future, to other, more economically attractive locations. And it had been doing so for a long, long time. Although they dispersed to sites both far and near, one area in particular proved the most powerful magnet for Connecticut expatriates. This was the part of northeast Ohio stretching 120 miles west from the Pennsylvania border, a place many people called New Connecticut, but which was also known and is today still called Connecticut's Western Reserve. This was a part of its original charter territory that Connecticut received ownership of when it ceded the remainder of its charter lands to the newly formed United States in 1786. The journey west was both long and hard, between 500 and 650 miles, depending on the route selected and the destination. Road conditions ranged from very bad to deplorable for most of the journey. In heavy rains, roads became mud pits and streams impassable. In some low-lying or wetland areas, efforts were made to ameliorate the muddy conditions by building corduroy roads of logs placed perpendicular to the direction of travel, which provided their own unique kind of jarring discomfort. It was an experience no traveler would ever forget. In addition to the considerable physical dangers of traveling bad roads, fording swelled streams and rivers, and climbing and descending high mountain passes, migrants commonly experienced inhospitable treatment at overcrowded and often squalid inns and taverns. They slept fitfully among strangers, ate bad food with rowdy, drunken, and sometimes dangerous fellow migrants, and they fought off both homesickness and fear of the unknown. How did all these migrants feel about pulling up roots and leaving their native state? Some undoubtedly felt a pioneer's excitement at facing a world that was all possibility. Others, perhaps younger sons not in line to inherit the family farm, seethed with resentment about being forced into exile. And some, it is clear, saw having to leave Connecticut for the West as a sign of shame, a visible symbol that they were the expendable ones. How else can we explain Margaret Van Horn Dwight's comment on day 2 of her journey? The country we pass through till we're beyond New York, I need not describe to you, nor indeed could I, for I am attended by a very unpleasant, though not uncommon companion, one to whom I have bowed in subjection ever since I left you, pride. It has entirely prevented me seeing the country, lest I should be known, and so I suppose it will attend me to the mountains, and then I'm sure it will bid me adieu. Hiding in the wagon so she wouldn't be recognized. This is an aspect of outmigration that we rarely encounter and almost never think about. But once we see it, it certainly complicates those long-standing stories of Anglos hot in the pursuit of manifest destiny. Surely, Connecticutans left their state with mixed emotions. But even as young Connecticutans were moving out of the state, others were moving in. Connecticut had found its future in harnessing its abundant water power to drive the factories of the Industrial Revolution, and that created an unprecedented need for workers to build a new kind of infrastructure. The Irish in Connecticut chapter covers nearly 350 years of the Irish story in this state, but tonight I'd like to present 3 snapshots. The first of what it was like for the Irish who came to Connecticut in the years just before the potato famine of the mid-1840s. And then I want to jump ahead a half century to look at what life was like for the children and grandchildren of these migrants. And finally, we'll close with a consideration of what it means to be an Irish Connecticut today. So here we go. Enter the Irish. To meet the need for laborers, contractors for the Farmington Canal brought in 28 gangs of Irish canal workers called navvies from Galway and Cork. Hartford brought in 400 Irishmen for the Enfield Canal project. Life for the navvies was hellish. Like the Irish railroad track workers who soon followed them, they dug furiously from sunup to sunset, goaded by overseer contractors whose profits depended on how much labor they could extract every day. Eyewitnesses marveled at the physical prowess of the Irishmen as they ran full wheelbarrows up narrow planks from ditches 20 feet deep. They lived in temporary shanty camps where overcrowding, poor sanitation, and stagnant water made disease a constant. alcohol was woven into a workday marked by short bursts of furious digging, followed by a trip to the whiskey barrel and a dram from the jigger boss. Irish workers were paid only for the days weather and their health let them work, and they earned just 75 cents a day, one-third less than native-born laborers. The navvies represented Connecticut's first major influx of practicing Irish Catholics, and the descendants of Connecticut's Puritan founders didn't like that at all. Connecticut had no resident priests, and the Yankees made it clear they liked that just fine. When Reverend John Powers of New York requested permission to celebrate Mass for canal workers at New Haven's Protestant Seamen's Chapel on Long Wharf, he was told, "We have no popery in New Haven, and we don't want any." Now, despite this overt intolerance, popery did come to Connecticut, at first through the services of an itinerant priest from Rhode Island, who in 1828 conducted house masses on the east bank of the river in Hartford. The following year, Hartford became home to the Most Holy Trinity, Connecticut's first Catholic church. The newspaper, the Connecticut Observer, was simply aghast. How will it read in history that in 1829, Hartford, in the state of Connecticut, was made the center of a Roman Catholic mission? Well, nice beginning. But let's jump forward a half century and see how the children and grandchildren of these unwanted firstcomers are doing. Unlike their fathers, by 1900, two-thirds of second-generation Irish men worked in skilled trades or higher, with economic security mirroring that of the Connecticut Yankees. Irish-American men dominated police and fire departments and monopolized the building trades. And while 90% of their mothers remained domestic servants, second-generation Irish-American daughters rose to become clerks, skilled factory workers, teachers, and union organizers too. Better jobs came in part because of high Irish involvement in Connecticut's labor movement. Irish Americans made up most of many unions' membership and also most of their leadership. So, I suspect at least one or two of you out there are Irish, and you know what it's like to be Irish today. To be Irish American in Connecticut today is for those lucky enough to claim Irish American ancestry a source of both identity and pride, underscored by an extraordinary long-term record of Irish Connecticut's achievements in politics, law, public safety, commerce, industry, and culture. The fact that such achievements were made by a people once reviled as incapable, discriminated against as inferior, and treated as unwelcome interlopers in a society that took offense at their very presence, is an important reminder, and perhaps especially in times like these, that the very people we fear at one moment can sometimes turn out to be the source of some of our society's greatest strengths. Connecticut's most important cultural icon, and we're home to many, is the Gilded Age author and satirist Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain. His historic home in Hartford is also one of the country's great historic landmarks. In Mark Twain and the Historic House Problem, I come right out and I ask the question I think many people think about when they visit the house of this great man, but they're a little too shy or polite, or they have better manners than I and they just don't ask it. Not me. I go to the Twain house, I go right up to the docent, and I ask that most potent question, why can't I smell smoke? Twain was no ordinary smoker. He was a deeply committed, unregenerate, professional pipe and cigar smoker who mastered his craft at an early age and continued to improve upon it for the next 68 years. In the great age of industrial production, Twain turned himself into a literary factory, belching cigar smoke as the words poured forth. Wherever Twain went, tobacco smoke followed, and one of his greatest fears was to be where tobacco wasn't. In 1867, one day before sailing to Honolulu from British Columbia, Twain found a local wholesale tobacconist and brought 3,000 cheroots, those are small cigars, and 15 pounds of tobacco. That was about one cigar per nautical mile of the impending voyage. Now, later that afternoon, he went back and he bought 3,000 more cheroots. And that night, shortly after beginning a farewell public lecture, Twain stopped his talk in midstream. He called his manager up to the stage and he said, "Pond, I fear that cigar place may close before I get through here. You go there now and get 1,500 more of those cheroots." In the morning, Twain and his 7,500 cigars, plus his tobacco, happily embarked for the Sandwich Isles. Now, Twain knew that smoking was generally unhealthy, but he saw the habit as a kind of life vest that provided a wellness safety margin. He liked to tell the story of the doctor who visited an 80-year-old woman who was in rapidly failing health. "You must stop drinking," the doctor told her. "I have never touched a drop of alcohol in my life," she answered. "Then you must immediately give up smoking," the doctor said. "I have never, ever smoked," she answered indignantly. "Well then," the doctor replied, "there's no way I can help you. You are a sinking ship with no freight to throw overboard." Well, I suspect most people would agree that elections in recent years, at least some of them, have left people on both sides of the political aisle with a bad taste in their mouths. That's why it might be time to revive one of our state's oldest and for centuries most time-honored traditions, the Connecticut election cake. What's an election cake and why is it a Connecticut tradition? An election cake was a big, rich fruit, spice, and sugar yeast cake baked up in huge quantities and served to all comers during the festivities surrounding first our colonies and later our state's annual elections. The story of how election cake became a Connecticut tradition goes all the way back to the days of the Puritans. One of the things that made the Puritans so pure was that they didn't believe in the annual round of Catholic and Anglican holidays. They didn't celebrate Christmas or Easter or any of the numerous saints and festival days, and for them, New Year's Day came on March 25th, so no midnight kisses or dropping ball either. Now, while they rejected all of these supposedly invented occasions for mirth, they did believe that in the year 1662, Connecticut, for reasons that are still not exactly clear, got something that very much was worth celebrating, a royal charter from King Charles II that gave the Connecticut colony virtual independence more than a century before the American Revolution. Unlike Massachusetts and Virginia and the other royally governed American colonies, Connecticut could make its own laws and, more important, elect its own leaders without royal oversight. This right to choose their own leaders was seen from the start as fundamentally important and distinctive, something worth celebrating and worth protecting. So it's not surprising, I think, that on those days when Connecticutans gathered to choose their leaders, back then Election Day took place in early May, these otherwise celebration-starved Puritans found reason to celebrate, and what better way to do so than with cake, and lots of it. Now, we know Connecticutans were feasting on election cakes well before the American Revolution, because the colonial records tell us so. But if incorporating election cake into the ceremonies was an important Connecticut tradition before the Revolution, it became much more important after. As Connecticutans themselves spread across the countries to the new lands of the American West, The election cake tradition went with them. Election cake recipes appear in early cookbooks in states across the nation, and they're abundantly found in the manuscript cookbooks left by individuals in our historical societies and archives. Reading these works, a few things become crystal clear. Election cakes were central to the election rituals in many places, but especially here in Connecticut. And making an extraordinary election cake, perhaps with a special ingredient of your own or a unique mixing process that improved the flavor, became a point of honor with many homekeepers. Clearly, having a reputation for making delicious election cakes became a competitive source of status. During the 1800s, as Connecticut industrialized, welcomed people from new nations, broke its official ties to the old Puritan church, and experienced the sectional divide that led to the American Civil War, some of Connecticut's time honored election day traditions, like riding out to meet the new governor as he made his way into the Capitol, or parading behind the state's ministers to hear an election sermon in the First Congregational Church. These fell by the wayside, but the election cake remained a steady and very delicious habit. When the General Assembly decided in 1876 to change the start of its sessions from May to early January, beginning in 1877, a journalist lamenting the switch of Election Day to midwinter wrote, "The coming election parade of May 1876 is likely to be the last that will take place in Connecticut. Though the sermon has gone out, though the parade is going out, though the whole institution may become an element of the past, one feature of it will always remain, and that is the election cake. Lovers of it, when it's just right, say no other cake equals it, and it's only necessary to add that nobody can make it but a Connecticut housekeeper, and that each housekeeper and her circle of adherents knows she can make it a deal better than any of her rivals." Well, perhaps this is exactly the right time for the Connecticut election cake to make its comeback. At this moment, when American politics seems so divisive and so bitter, and we are so divided, wouldn't it be great if a cohort of culinary Connecticutans, men and women equally this time, joined together to use their ovens to remind people that democracy, this right to choose the people who rule our government, is a sweet privilege indeed. And what better way could there be to celebrate sweet democracy than to bring back the tradition of the Connecticut election cake? Now, before the last election, I started promoting this idea, and I was truly happy that in towns around Connecticut, many people adopted the election cake. Even in a time of COVID, they adopted this idea of baking an election cake and sharing it with people who maybe they politically did not see eye to eye with. And I want to vigorously and passionately invite you to think about joining in this bakery crusade for democracy. Now, I have a copy of the election cake recipe in the book Creating Connecticut, but the last thing I would do is insist that anyone buy the book to get this recipe, because we're on a mission for America. So in a few minutes, I'm going to put up my email address. And if you would like a recipe for a Connecticut election cake, modernized so you can bake it today, just send me an email at walt@uconn.edu. I'll put it on the screen in a little bit. And I will send you a modernized election cake recipe. If you bake the cake, I hope you'll send me another email, perhaps with a picture of the cake. Tell me how, what you thought of it and how it went over with the people you served it to. I truly lament what's happened to politics in this country. And I think one of the best ways we can begin to heal these wounds is to sit down and eat something very good together and talk about our differences with a smile. So that's the election cake story. Now, there it is, an overview of the 24 stories in Creating Connecticut. And I have to say that what you've heard tonight is only a sampler. In addition to the little bits of the stories you've heard, there are stories on the rough justice meted out by the British to Connecticut's state hero, Nathan Hale. I tell that story, and then I go on to recount the incredible story, and it truly is, of 1935's Pull Out All the Stops 300th anniversary of Connecticut's founding. I am proud to present the inspiring 275-year-old story of the Lyman family's whatever it takes devotion to make and keep Lyman orchards a thriving Connecticut farm for 2 3/4 centuries. There's a story in there about the Puritans' only art form, gravestone carving, something for which Connecticut is truly noted. There's a profile of Irish born Governor John Dempsey, one of Connecticut's most popular governors and the only immigrant governor of Connecticut since the colonial era. And there's a meditation on just what it is that makes Connecticut such a unique state. And that's just a sample. I really hope that you like what you've heard enough to want to read more. And if you do, you'll come to the Bethel Library and check out a copy, or you'll pick up a copy of Creating Connecticut at your local bookstore, or you'll order one online. I didn't check today, but recently I checked, and you can get the book at Amazon for around $20. If you're a Prime member, they'll do free shipping. And of course, if you would like a signed copy of the book, I will be very happy to send you one. With tax and mailing and the things, I sell it for $30, and that's pretty much a lost leader. But you get that wonderful signature, oh boy, and whatever inscription you would like, that, as long as it's something I could write and not be indicted for, I'm happy to do it. And of course, if you would like a copy of the election cake recipe, note the address, walt@uconn.edu, the shortest address at the University of Connecticut, and I will be happy to send it to you. With that in mind, I am going to give the screen back to Ms. Davenport, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. And I thank you so much for your time and attention and the opportunity to let you talk, or to let me talk to you about this introduction to Connecticut history I hope you'll want to know more about. So, Amy, back to you. Are you muted, Amy, by any chance? I am.
Can't hear you.
There you go. I can. Oh, Amy, if you can hear me, you're still muted. So, Amy, you're still muted. Why don't you type into chat, and I'll become Amy for the moment. So, okay, let me. Is this? Do I need to? Is there something I need to do for you, Amy? No, you just have lost your connection. Okay, Amy and I are playing 20 questions or pantomime. So let me do this. If you have a question about the book, I would love to have a mad rush to ask me a question, but I'm hoping somebody may have one. And why don't you just go ahead, bravely unmute your microphone and fire away. Quentin, I see you. I'm looking at you. Do you have a question?
No.
No requirement. Here is Oh, well, there's a very nice comment about the presentation. Can I tell you more about Alice Young? Actually, I cannot, although, oh gosh, I can't remember who. Someone has, a very careful kind of researcher in Connecticut has written a book about Alice Young that is based on the most research she could find and some speculation. It's a historical fiction. uh, it's a historical fiction about Alice Young, and I wish if someone knows the title of it, I would be happy to I'd be happy to share it with people. Um, she we the really interesting thing about the witch trials, both in